We are joined by writer and political commentator Pete Shmigel, who has a background in sustainability, business, military, mental health and, of course, Ukraine. Pete, welcome to Spectator TV.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Pete, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has created, for lack of a better description, a weird political vibe in Australia. There are an unusually large amount of freedom supporters and blue ribbon conservatives and free speech advocates who fall down on the side of Putin's communist dictatorship. I find that quite startling. But let's not forget that Putin is famous for killing journalists and dismantling democracy. Even the recent assumed murder of his political opposition has failed to raise eyebrows over here. Now, generally, this affection for Putin stems from the traditional values that he appears to embody against the rising tide of woke. But opposing woke doesn't necessarily mean that you are a friend of freedom. Now, before we get on to some of your articles, Pete, do you think Australia's physical geographical distance from Europe, coupled with massive gaps in our historical knowledge of European conflicts, is part of the reason for this bizarre take that we have on the Russian-Ukraine conflict?
I think that's a salient observation, absolutely, that we sometimes forget our history and we sometimes forget our context. You just have to come to Sydney and you have to look out from Circular Quay and you see a place called Pinchgut, a fortress. And that fortress was created to fend and defend Sydney Harbour from who? The Russian Empire. So, you know, in the 19th century, our forebears were wise enough to understand that this was a genuine threat to their sovereignty and their security, e.g. the Russian Empire. It's almost kind of odd that even though Russia is in some respects much closer to us now as a result of technology, we downgrade the possible risk to ourselves. And look, and beyond the direct risk, you know, we have to think about what our interests are. And, you know, we have long been part of the international rules-based order and everything that goes with it. We've always been seen as punching above our weight in that regard as a medium-sized power, and a power with great moral sway as well. And to think that we would allow somebody like Putin, whose number one goal is the destruction of that rules-based order, to have favor here in this country is, yes, you're right, quite startling. And it's hard to explain to oneself people making a bridge, if you will, from an anti-woke position to a pro-Putin position. There's got to be better ways to go.
It makes about as much sense as queers and feminists for Palestine, in my view of the world. But we have those two ideologies walking hand in hand, and that is the situation we are faced with. But you've written a piece for the Kiev Post titled, "Don't Look for Logic in What the Kremlin Says." Now, it is subtitled, "Russians have long taken pride in their ability to undermine enemies with propaganda. Today, their propagandists are trying to weaponize the West's faith in the virtue of free speech." Pete, you appear to imply through your article that the way the West views speech and treats information is a weakness that can be exploited by Russia's propaganda machine. How does that work? Can you give us an example?
Look, Russian propaganda has been formally part of its military doctrine for 100 years. And as part of that, the goal is to basically fray the edges, you know, to pull at the left and pull at the right, et cetera. And that's what we see happening now. We need to bear that in mind when we read statements from Russia, that they have a very keen understanding of how our political dynamic works, how our context works. You know, the classic one is the two sides of every story sort of approach that all of us as journalists and as writers have in the West. And somehow we give credit to, you know, Party A and Party B. They know this very well, so they can put any kind of ludicrous statement out there and get equal coverage for it in terms of our media. And what does that serve to do? It serves to embolden, you know, some folks who are out there on the fringes of debate. And that is in Russia's best interest, is to constantly pull at that social contract, to constantly pull at our capacity for consensus, to constantly pull at our capacity to actually see facts and see objectivity. In the world of alternative reality, you can get away with anything. So, for example, you can get away with an invasion of a foreign country on the basis, oh, we're defending against NATO, or oh, we're fighting Nazis, or oh, There are Russian-speaking communities down there that merit our protection. Each and every one of those is a total fabrication. But in a world where there is no objective truth, lies can easily stand and can easily motivate military action.
Well, it reminds me very much of what we already see here in the West amongst the Marxist university campuses, where they use the whole idea of my truth to override objective truth. Except instead of one individual doing it, we've got an entire nation using the my truth way around objective problems that are happening in the world that have real facts. Now, you have said, and I'm going to quote... You go.
The Russian name for its propaganda efforts is exactly in line with what you just said. It's called maskirovka, and maskirovka literally means to put on a mask, to deceive. So again, this is a formal weapon of Russian military craft, is to lie on an industrial scale. And it's kind of pathetic, frankly, for people who are otherwise sober in their thoughts about Australia's political system to actually fall for it in the way that some of our friends on the libertarian side or some of our friends on the conservative side have fallen for it in the last couple of years. Like they really need a kind of cold shower on the degree to which they're being exploited by somebody else.
Well, you have said, and I quote your recent article, while the West looks for clear and linear logic in what the Kremlin does and says, Moscow deploys a veritable water cannon of claims, opposing claims, distractions and distortions, knowing that incongruence is to their advantage. Now, indeed, you actually go further to say the Kremlin avoids basing its narratives on truth entirely, preferring outright fabrication, which is what we saw employed during the whole recent terror attack that was claimed by ISIS. Now, Pete, why is the West in love with propaganda? Is it tied up in this believe nothing narrative where the public have turned against Western media outlets, which is partly their fault during what they peddled during the COVID campaign and the climate campaign? They have been lying. In other words, are we believing what the Kremlin, says almost because we're going to get a one-up on domestic media?
It's an interesting analysis. I mean, is what's happening in part our own fault and our own responsibility? We, in some respects, as a media establishment, as participants in public policy debate, probably have become kind of weak in our own ways. And we too have resorted to subjectivity and relativism and respecting a whole range of points of view, even if they have no fact base, et cetera, et cetera. So if I was out to kind of, again, undermine the rules-based order, undermine Western liberal democratic traditions, why wouldn't I exploit that weakness? My interest to create, an alternative reality that has no truth nicely aligns with our own sort of failings, if you will.
It's kind of depressing. When I was in school, when I was in school, they actually taught us that there is no real truth. Everything is personal truth, and there is no single storyline. We were taught that in visual arts, we were taught that in English, and that started creeping into history. It's gotten worse now, where there is no truth in any genre now. But that is what you've said there is exactly what we have trained 3 generations of Australians to think, which is quite dangerous. Now, we have seen a rise in domestic propaganda since this whole Marxism resurrected itself in the petri dish of higher education. But you say that Russia are experts, beginning 100 years ago during the Tsarist reign. Now, you wrote that Russia exploits this from the West, but how do they do it? Is it a couple of Russian trolls? Do they have an industrial level online complex set up? How do they do that to us?
Look, it's a very elaborate and highly resourced machine. No Western liberal democracy could compete with the amount of money and human resource that Russia puts into its strategic communications or its propaganda efforts. And whether that's flooding online channels to try to get to the 1%ers and the 2%ers in our own community who readily sprout and repeat conspiracy theories of all sorts of different kinds, or whether it's the classic means that we have seen through the whole Cold War period. It's interesting to me that in the last 2 years, there hasn't been much public attention given to the notion of agents of influence. Do we seriously think that somehow Russia, just because the Cold War finished, stopped paying people in the West to spruik its ideas? Do we seriously think that Russia doesn't use the fifth columnists that we know that they used for 30 and 40 years of the Cold War? All of these things remain in place as technical means. Moreover, it's sort of not noted very much that Vladimir Putin himself is a former KGB agent. He was schooled in these very methods. He was stationed in East Germany, where there was a very aggressive campaign mounted against East Germans over decades to ensure their adherence to certain truths, if you will, of socialism and communism. So again, whether it's our own fault, whether it's naivete on our part, it's kind of time for the West to wake up to the fact that there is, a very aggressive party out there that wishes us nothing but the worst, and uses every means, technical and otherwise, possible in its communication to achieve that.
Of course, what we have to talk about is what the point of all this propaganda is. Is it simply to facilitate Russia's military interests in things like Ukraine and other bordering nations, where it's turning a population, for example, Australia, against the narrative of Ukraine in order to pressure politicians into not giving money or arms to Ukraine, which would help it win a war, obviously, if it does that in America or it does that in the UK? Or is this a wider game, a larger game that Russia is playing to subvert the power of the West in general? What is your take on what's happening?
Look, I think that we need to look at Russia as what it is, and that it's essentially that it has an imperial mindset. And that imperial mindset is one of many centuries standing, whether it was rebranded as the Soviet Union for a period or not. Putin has spoken clearly about his imperial intentions, about being a successor of Peter the Great in terms of the expansion of Russia, if not in a geographical sense, and certainly in a geopolitical sense. One of the motivating factors of Russian domestic politics is for the strong man to be seen as cultivating the greater Russia, or as it's referred to, Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And it works for the Russians on a variety of levels. That domestic level, in terms of distracting people from the fact that half the country doesn't have indoor plumbing. Outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It gives them this great myth to believe in, on the one hand. On the other hand, it gives them undue influence over the broader global stage. You're talking about a country that, punches well below its weight economically, but for natural resources and oil, but nevertheless is a Security Council member and wishes to exert its will in a way that's disproportionate to its actual legitimate power, if you will. So, look, I think Russian propaganda narratives work on a variety of levels, and therefore they are that intricate, that well designed, because they have to work at a whole series of strata.
Well, you included a chilling quote from Goebbels, which is, propaganda works best when those who are being manipulated are confident that they are acting of their own free will. And that certainly seems to be the case of what's going on today in the West. Look, this is a fascinating topic. It is a huge topic, and I'm going to get you back on for a proper hour show to discuss this more in length. But thank you for writing this stuff in The Spectator, for sharing this with our audience. Where can people find you if they want to read more about this, what's happening with Russian propaganda?
Look, I'm very grateful of being able to appear in Spectator Australia every once in a while. I'm also in Kiev Post, both as a straight journalist and as an opinion contributor there in Kiev Post, which is probably the largest English language website covering the war and covering Ukraine at the moment. And someplace there on Medium, I think there are some articles floating around as well. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spectator TV.
Pleasure.